You are listening to the Audacious Ecosystem, the show where we learn together what it takes to make an ecosystem great from the leaders in your organizations around us.
Greetings, fellow interneted people. My name is Andrei Doda, and today's guest is myself. I think we're gonna need a name for this series from now on. If you have any suggestions, just please let me know. Whatever means of communication is more appropriate for you, I'll be glad to take absolutely any considerations that you have. Thank you so very much. And today's subject, the thing that we're going to talk about today, is the scale of ecosystems. Now, first up, we did touch just a bit on this subject matter in previous episodes. We have talked about the fact that ecosystems are sort of fractal. There's always the ability to zoom in and find another ecosystem and zoom out and find that our ecosystem is part of a larger ecosystem. That's all good and great. We've also talked about the fact that there's physical and digital ecosystems, and there's some differences between the two. We're going to get into some of that a little bit later. But today, we're going to be diving deep into one particular question. Today, we're going to dive into an age-old argument. Does size matter, or does it matter how you use it? I'm talking about the ecosystem size. In order to answer that question, we will first need to address one thing. The size of the community that we are working on will be different from case to case, from city to city, from digital corner to digital corner. Our needs on a human level are highly different from our needs as a team or as a group of people, which are, yet again, highly different from the needs of a country or a larger organization. And those will also differ from the needs of a smaller country or an even larger country. So let's take them one at a time. On an individual human level, we have a few basic needs. There's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which talks about physical needs and safety needs and so forth. So we do have needs like food and water and a shelter and healthcare and social interactions and other activities in order to make us thrive. If we take that pyramid of needs, that Maslow's pyramid of needs, it might not be working just as well for organizations, and especially for ecosystems. If on an individual level we can follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs, well, on a local level, on a very small ecosystem, that will differ greatly. Let's take a very small ecosystem. Let's say that you're a startup in its first year of activity, and you have a community of 200 people. Well, that small ecosystem will have very different needs from that of an individual. If we have this small ecosystem, well, small by some measures, but if we have that ecosystem, that digital ecosystem, you have some particular needs. First up, you need to offer the value, the reason people are there. In the context of a software as a service platform, it might mean having the manpower or the resources in order to generate the software capabilities to better serve that group of people. It might mean you will need something in order to ensure that the quality of the service is delivered according to standards. You will especially need some way to make sure that you are constantly communicating and constantly actually understanding the user group which you are serving. But those needs will differ greatly from larger organization needs. For example, if you are a multinational, you'll have very different needs from a startup. If you're a huge tech company, let's say, actually, let's not give out names this time, but if you're a multinational company, a tech company, compared to a startup, your priorities differ greatly. First up, you will need some sort of HR. You will need very good systems in place to make sure that your cybersecurity is on point. You will become a target for both lawsuits, internal and external, as well as for outsider attacks. You will need to have in place an appropriate culture that makes sure that outside of the people that you can meet even in a whole week in a company with 20,000 employees, it's not pretty reasonable to actually be able to meet with every single individual on a daily basis. So you need to make sure that you have a system, some particular processes in place to ensure that the culture that is being created within your organization is actually the culture that reflects the executive desires. You will also have to address whatever investors want. You'll also have to make sure that you are very, very correctly ticking all of the boxes created by the governments. You'll also have to make sure that your hiring processes are all put in place. And you will have highly, highly different needs from one startup, which is maybe just scrapping for cash, barely making ends meet, and just trying to make the best they can just to make it to the next round of funding. And those needs are very different from the needs of a multinational company. But just understanding the spectrum, understanding how different they can be and how different your platform and your ecosystem of stakeholders which you are serving and how you are serving them will be, is highly relevant in order to ensure that you choose your problems correctly. And we'll get into that in just a bit. First up, whatever size of an ecosystem that we are talking about, in whatever context, we will need to talk about governance. No, I don't mean that you're going to go and create a sovereign country. I don't mean that. I mean governance in the sense that somebody needs to take the responsibility and the power to make the final choices within your ecosystem. For example, let's take Google Play. On Google Play, there's obviously a user review process. Your users will download whatever application that you want, and they will see the value that it is providing or not providing, or how much of a scam that is, and they will decide to act accordingly and leave an appropriate number of stars and an appropriate level of hateful comments towards how buggy your application is or how buggy your software is. And sure, there is the user-generated system. But at the same time, you will also need to have someone to make the final say. In the event that, let's say, some piece of software proves to be tracking all applications on your phone at all times, even when the application is not open, and that goes against the terms of service of the platform on which that piece of software is being distributed. Let's, for the ease of actually speaking out a real world case, let's take that time Uber was actually tracking all of their users, and Google Play as well as the iStore, the Apple Store, decided to take down their the application for Uber. In that case, somebody had to both put in place the rules, put in place the decision-making system by which we ensure that we are gonna uphold some kind of rules, which sure we are creating, but the rules will be respected. And also in the case of an emergency, if we realize that this is a really critical endeavor that might put people at risk, somebody also has to have the power to intervene. If this is going really badly, we need to be able to do something about it, as well as have somebody to, quote unquote, blame for the financial results or not. The governing body, organization, whatever, that operates over a digital ecosystem is there to ensure that a few specific but extremely important things are able to happen. One of those things is, for example, ecosystem assessment. If we create an ecosystem, a digital ecosystem in which it's a complete free-for-all, I just put this software out there. Everybody can use it, and they can do whatever they want on it, and we will do nothing about it. I'm not going to call names on that, but let's say we do that. In that case, we're not even aware if something bad does happen. We're not even aware how our ecosystem is growing, what exactly even exists on the ecosystem, how many of one particular category of stakeholder groups are there or aren't there, how much or how well do we actually respect the governing principles of the governments in which we are operating, and so forth. Within any digital entity, one of the first principles that a governing body of an ecosystem, of a digital ecosystem, is actually doing is making sure that they are assessing the status of the ecosystem. Is it actually thriving? Is it dying? What are the problems? What are the risks that might happen in the very near future? What are the things that we should be on the lookout for? What is actually going on our platform? The governing body, whatever size that might be, will have to actually do an assessment. And they don't do an assessment just because they want to do an assessment. They will do an assessment as a governing body of an ecosystem, of a digital ecosystem, in order to ensure that they understand what is happening and what needs to be done in order to achieve the goals of the stakeholders, be it the investors, be it the users, be it the creators on the platform, and so forth. Now, that's one of the very first things that a governing entity does in an ecosystem. Assessment. Making sure everybody has the information required and making sure somebody is actually at least understanding what's happening. Maybe not controlling it, but at least understanding what is actually happening. Now, the second thing a governing entity with us, of actually any kind of governing entity does, is to create changes, to actually implement changes in order to ensure a growth or the amelioration of a risk that is about to happen. We've done our research. We looked into what is actually in our ecosystem, what's the status of everything, what's our trajectory, what are our risks, and what does every stakeholder group want, and how is it being fulfilled at the moment, and how can we actually, with the resources that are at hand, how will we be able to fulfill them? Now, the second function is to actually provide change. Any governing entity, for this subject matter, any startup, any entrepreneur that actually wants to create the change on their platform will need to actually implement changes. That may be rolling changes every single day, for example, in cybersecurity patches, or it may mean monthly or bi-weekly or quarterly changes to how the system actually runs, to how the ecosystem is actually employed on a software basis. What do I mean by that? If, for example, in the assessment phase, we realize that we don't have enough of a particular group of stakeholders, let's say, for the sake of the example, let's say people from Sweden that are into sports cars. For whatever reason, for whatever platform that we are building, what we actually saw in our assessment phase is that the number of individuals on our platform that actually are from Sweden, that are into sports cars, is not large enough compared to what it should be at this particular moment in time, based on our perceived understanding of where we want to go. What a governing entity, a digital governing entity, will do for its platform is to ensure that that change is able to happen. Thirdly is maintenance. Any governance, any digital ecosystem governance entity, whatever that might actually mean for you, be it a startup or a corporation, will have to ensure that the software is maintained. We talked earlier about cybersecurity patches. Sure, that's one thing. But you need a lot more maintenance in order to ensure that your software is actually up and running and actually ensuring that the changes you want it to happen do actually happen. That's the third phase. And last but definitely not least, it will have to employ, let's call it, public relations. What do I mean by that? Any software entity, any software ecosystem which we are building will actually have to respect quite a lot of rules. First up, we will obviously have to create our own internal rules, how we do things on this platform, to whatever degree that we want to ensure the rules. Even Reddit, for example, even the most niche of subreddits, even those will have some form of rules. Whatever procedures that we put in place doesn't really matter. It's just a set of rules that we are creating, and it will ensure that this is how this will operate. That's the first step of public relations. The second step is, well, actually, it kind of comes before that, but we have to make sure that we are actually respecting the rules of the governments in which we are operating. All internet-based companies still have to operate somewhere, like physically, like in the real world. They have to be registered somewhere in the world. No matter how much Spotify might want, they will still have to respect the EU regulations and the North American regulations and Asian regulations and many more. In whichever market we are operating, we have to ensure that we are respecting those rules and we are actually keeping a line of communications with the entities that are actually offering us those rules. If, for example, something were to happen, some cyber attack were to happen, we would need to ensure that we as the quote-unquote governing body over our digital ecosystem, we are able to actually get back to the entity that's actually doing the cyber criminal assessment. That's the first two. Now, this third one comes a little bit from international relations. But we also have to have some form of policies with the other digital ecosystems that exist out there. They may be addressing other markets, they may be addressing other people. We might not even care about some other companies. For example, if you are doing a matchmaking platform for luxury yachts, you might not really care about what Nike might have to say, most likely. Just a guess. I suppose not. You might. I don't know. But in that particular context, we have to ensure that we understand what other governing bodies exist out there. For example, let's take YouTube. Let's take YouTube and TikTok as an quote-unquote international internet relations study case. Those two they're fairly similar in one manner. They're fairly similar ecosystems in one manner, but they are very different in the vastness and how seasoned YouTube is compared to TikTok and so forth. Both have to have some line of communications. They need to address some changes being made by the other quote-unquote governmental body addressing the ecosystem. If TikTok makes some changes on the platform, YouTube would also need to have some form of measures that will also address those changes. Hey, we see you, we see what you changed, and here's how we'll address it. Did I bore you enough with the governmental part? I promise we will not address it for a few episodes. But we really need to talk about it, because the larger of an ecosystem you're building, the larger of a governmental entity that you will need to have in place. The larger and more complex the group of stakeholders that is actually on your digital ecosystem, the larger and more complex your structures, your internal structures as a company, as a startup will have to be, in order to ensure that you're actually operating to the standards that the people you are serving actually expect you to operate at. For example, when you are at a pre-seed stage, it's fine not to have particular departments. For example, it's fine not to have that great of a branding, maybe, although we can talk about that. But it's fine not to have particular things. It's fine not to have somebody addressing specifically the international quote-unquote relations on the internet with other brands. It's fine not to have somebody dedicated to talking with the users or the creators on the platform, and actually it's one person doing multiple jobs, wearing multiple hats. It's fine. But as we grow, we will need to expand our governmental presence upon our digital ecosystem. It's just important to be aware of what might be needed from us in the near future. Just to be aware. It doesn't mean that it should occupy right now a lot of mental energy. It just means that, hey, this is something important. This will likely at some point become a point that we will need to address. And this is how they addressed it in the past. This is how we might want to address it in our current circumstances. We talked about governmental presence of the digital ecosystem enough. Now, why does size matter? It matters mostly due to what you will attract. It sounded very wrong. I'm not sorry for how it sounded, but it sounded very wrong. It matters because the size of our ecosystem will define the types of people that we will attract. For example, you might have the most dedicated people, the most seasoned people that have ever existed, the most dedicated people that are able to do 50 jobs in one, and they will be perfect for the very beginning startup stage. They'll be perfect for that. That's great. But those same people are likely not the ones you really, really, really need at the IPO stage. They are great and they can do a lot, and they are very needed at that stage, but they might not serve the best purpose in a huge ecosystem when everybody has to do some very specific tasks and they have to have a very high depth of knowledge on one specific matter. It also matters in the kinds of people we will attract in our company. It also matters in the kinds of problems that we will be attracting and we will be deciding to actually attract. If we have an ecosystem that is in the millions of people, we are bound to find some crazies. When we are talking about millions of people, tens of millions of people, it is bound at some point for some crazy stuff to happen and for some crazy people to appear and for some weird stuff to be going on our platforms. It's just bound for that to happen just because this is how 1 in a million chances actually work. The larger our ecosystem is, the larger and more specific our problems actually become and the more important they are. For example, if we have an ecosystem serving tens of millions of people, it is very likely that one lawsuit will not be some small lawsuit by just one individual. When we have something large, it will also usually attract large problems. So people that are inclined to propose a lawsuit will also notice you and will take note of what you're doing. For example, look at Napsters. Napsters was the predecessor. Napster was like Spotify before Spotify ever existed, and it actually got into trouble not when it started off, not when it was growing, but rather when it hit a critical mass and enough people were aware of it that also the people that would propose the lawsuits, in that case, I'm not going to name names. When those people were aware of it, it became a large enough thing for it to be aware of. In that case, you will also have to expect to allocate a part of your budget strictly for legal matters and for people deciding to take you to court. It's just bound to happen. We just need to be aware of it. It's not something good or bad. It just happens. And we need to be aware that this is something that will actually come into play. Now, if you're like most people, you might think bigger is better. I'm not gonna say that's what she said. I'm trying my best not to say it. A bigger ecosystem will usually mean bigger opportunities. And yeah, sure, that sounds fair enough, but it depends. You might not actually want a bigger level of opportunity, since a bigger level of opportunity also comes with a bigger level of responsibility. For example, if you want to work at a company, you will maybe find it a more lucrative place to work at a multinational, at a software company that has been running for decades. It has IPO'd years ago, like decades ago, and it's been doing really well. And you take an executive position there, and your payout every single year is in the millions. That can be great. But every single bad decision is also highly, highly scrutinized at that level. You need to understand, just be aware that when you get to that level, when you are, for example, an executive in the Apple office, any bad choice you will make is gonna cost billions. It's likely gonna cost people's livelihoods, people who had nothing to do with your decision, but they will be affected because companies will do layoffs in order to solve their financial problems. You just need to be aware that a bigger ecosystem will come with better opportunities. Yes, if we move to a larger city, we will have a better opportunity to find higher quality employment. That's great. That's all well and dandy. But we need to be aware, we do need to be aware that bigger ecosystems will come with bigger problems as well. In a larger city, it's gonna be a lot harder just to make rent and just afford to live in that city. It's gonna be a lot harder to take a year off and re-examine where you're going in your life. It's a lot harder to just go about. I'm not saying it's bad. It's obviously quite good given that a larger structure, a larger ecosystem will offer better opportunities, but you just need to be aware better opportunities will come with better responsibilities and better problems. Just be aware what it actually means. In just the same manner, smaller ecosystems might have smaller problems that you're solving, maybe. If you're in a pre-seed stage in a startup and it's just 3 friends in a garage, you probably have a very low level of worries. You can afford to be working from relatively wherever. You can afford to be as scrappy as possible, which you couldn't afford in the other context. But if you're to join a smaller ecosystem, in the short term at the very least, there's a much smaller chance for a good opportunity for you. There's a much smaller chance of a payout for the actual work that you put in. It doesn't mean that it's worse, it doesn't mean that it's better. It's just different. It will also mean a different level of responsibility. When you are talking about a startup, you will have to wear many, many, many hats. And you will have to do and create the role of quite a lot of people at the same time. And you'll have to juggle between being a designer and being a developer and being a customer success and so forth. It doesn't mean that it's worse. It doesn't mean that it's better. It just is different. And it has a different system of actually working out. If you, for example, go to a small city and decide to live there, and that city is on a trajectory of going up and up and up and up and up, in 20 years, for example, if you buy a piece of real estate there, that piece of real estate might double or triple in price. let's say. Just the same manner, if we go in a evolving ecosystem when it is still smaller, when it's still the first 10 employees, if you just decide to join that type of organization, you might not get the same kind of payout, while at the same time not having those responsibilities in the bigger company, but you might have a different incentivization. You might be differently incentivized to actually stay in this particular ecosystem. You might not be looking at a startup in the same way that you'll be looking at a large corporate. In a corporation, it's pretty common to have an expectation to vest your stocks. For example, if you work at Google, you'll get a package with your monthly salaries and so forth and benefits, as well as a vested stocks package, meaning you'll have to continuously stay for a number of years at that company in order to vest your stock, in order to have had enough longevity in the company to ensure that you will get that money that is promised to be yours in the form of stocks into your bank account. In a startup, the things are a little bit different in the sense that you might be vesting for a pretty much indefinite future. You might be vesting for 5 years, you might be vesting for 10 years, or the actual vesting that you're doing might actually never work out. You are taking on a larger risk, potentially, from one perspective or another. You have different benefits, and the size that you choose has to be your choice. The size of the ecosystem that you decide to address, that you decide to serve, that you decide to be part of, has to consciously be your decision, because otherwise you'll find yourself in problems that you might not actually want to be dealing with. And that's really important. You will find yourself in problems which you have to choose, because it's not just the fun part that you'll be dealing with. You'll most likely be dealing with problems on a daily basis. So choosing your problems might be even more important than choosing whatever types of organization you want to join. Now, obviously, the higher you go, the less responsibility, quote unquote, you have, the more power you actually have over the whole thing. You can only do one specific task to the best of your abilities, but you cannot control the whole machinery. You can ensure that the machinery actually grows in whatever way you hope it does, but you do not have the ultimate control over the machinery. In a smaller ecosystem, in a startup, it's up to you. Well, pretty much everything is up to you. It's like 3 people and the other 2 have some other responsibilities, and then it's you, and whatever slice of the responsibility pie you get, that is 100% in your control. So that means that you can also have a much higher level of impact. There's no actual cap to the amount of value that you can deliver in a smaller ecosystem. If it's 200 people, it is completely reasonable to respond to every single email that you get, to get back really quickly, to actually solve every single problem that every single individual has under the sun, from the logo alignment from the font on the 3rd page of the legal resume, whatever else in a page that you didn't even know that you created by accident. It's completely fine to provide unreasonable amounts of value when you are in a small context. And that kind of value really does change people's lives. The higher of an organization you do create, the less of an individual ability to have impact you will be able to actually employ. The larger the organization that you will be creating, the smaller your individual impact will be, but the larger your communal impact might become. Now, from those two, from the pre-seed startup to the corporation that has had decades on the stock market, every single digital ecosystem finds itself somewhere on the spectrum. All digital ecosystems are somewhere in between. There's a huge variation on this scale, and wherever you find yourself, whatever market you will be addressing will be somewhere on this scale. It's up to you to decide where exactly you want to address which actual digital ecosystem you want to address on this scale. How large do you want it to be? How big of a problem, what kind of a problem you actually want to have on a Tuesday at 11 o'clock? I know it sounds a little bit stupid. I hear myself. Yes, it does sound pretty stupid, but that is actually the lens of how what you're going to be building is going to operate. You're going to have to mainly deal with problems. You're not going to be actually enjoying the fruits of your labor every single day. You will 97% of the time be dealing with a problem that arises. And that's fine. But be aware that on this spectrum, you will find yourself somewhere. You need to be aware where you are and what's the kind of problems that you want. Do you want to have the biggest problems under the sun, those that seem unreasonable to be solved even by an organization of 1 million people? Or do you want to have very niche but highly influential problems that you individually will be able to solve somebody's life, so to say? But there's one thing when we talk about digital ecosystems that I want to also address, and that is whenever we think about going in a market or addressing a particular digital ecosystem or joining a particular startup or a particular tech company, it's not as important what you join as the trend you're joining. Let me explain. It's much more relevant that you join Uber at the very beginning when they get Series A, before they even IPO, when it's an unreasonable amount of growth. From day to day, you get 3 times more customers. I just encourage you to take into account a little bit more the trend rather than the position at the moment. If you know, for example, in 3 or 5 or 10 years, you are going to end up being in the exact position that you want to end up in, that's quite a lot more important than deciding that you're going to join Microsoft as the whatever, and in 5 years you're going to be the executive of whatever department you want to be the executive of. That might not be as relevant, even if that's your position that you want. The trend might simply go against you with time. For example, if you wanted to be the executive of Windows 8, oh boy, I have some bad news for you. If you wanted, however, to be the executive of the Azure department, well, that's a very different story. Or the AI department, that, again, is a very different story. It matters a lot more the trend you're joining and how it is evolving rather than where it is right now. It doesn't matter if today we have 100 million potential users. It matters that in 2 or 3 or 5 years, if we just keep on doing this, the total addressable market will grow by 10 times. So it will be unreasonable not to expect that if we do our job well, our customer size will also grow in the next years. Let me get back to that question from earlier. Does the size of the ecosystem actually matter, or does it matter how you use it? My answer is yes. It's both of them. And the actual answer depends on you and whatever your goals are and whatever you want to achieve for your particular ecosystem and for the particular community that you are serving digitally. Nobody can actually tell you where you should be if you do not decide that for yourself. In the previous episode, we talked about culture and how you will be peer pressured by the environment that you find yourself in to conform to a particular way of being. That's applicable in this context as well. If you do not decide for yourself what is the environment that you want to be joining in, if you do not decide for yourself what is the ecosystem that you want to belong to, that decision will be made along the way for you by people, by the circumstances, and so forth. I cannot tell you what's better, to be in a smaller ecosystem or in a larger ecosystem, to be in a startup and decide that you're going to stay in that startup and you're going to stay a startup and you're going to stay small for the next decades and you do not want to have more than 10 people in this company, or if you should shoot for being the CEO at Apple. That's up to you. But you need to be aware that those are very, very, very big differences between the two. You need to know where exactly on the scale you want to be on, and what's your tolerance, how far this way or that way do you want to go, and do you find it acceptable to go? How small of a problem do you want to deal with? How many people do you want to interact on a daily basis? How much responsibility do you want to actually have on your shoulders from day to day? I cannot decide that for you. You have to decide that for yourself, and you have to make that decision for yourself and alongside your community which you are serving, whatever that ecosystem might be. Now, there's one caveat. We can be sure how small of an organization you can be, how small of an ecosystem you can be, but at least so far, I'm not sure we are aware how large of an organization you can be, how large of an ecosystem you can actually go towards. If my 2 cents are of relevance to you, I would just say that it's a lot more fun to start off small and go towards huge. It just is more interesting to see the whole spectrum, rather than just finding yourself a particular niche on this spectrum and deciding to be there for the rest of your life. Be it in a huge corporation or in a company with 100 people. It just, my 2 cents, it doesn't actually have to matter for you what my opinion is, but I think it's a bit more fun just to be able to see the spectrum. And obviously you will have to try it for yourself. Nobody can decide that for you. You have to actually go into field and actually experience how it is, what the energy is to be in a large corporation compared to a startup, what the day-to-day feels like to be in a startup where everybody is running around being a busy bee compared to a corporation where whatever happens. It's just different. And you need to be aware of how that feels like and how that's different from one person to another. Just be aware of it and just understand it. I'm not encouraging you to go either or. I'm not encouraging you to vote either or. I would, however, encourage you to leave your comment on what kind of ecosystem do you prefer. Do you prefer the startup or the corporation, or somewhere in between is the exact sweet spot for you? I'd love to have your opinion in the comments or at www.audaciousecosystem.com/ask. That is www.audaciousecosystem.com/ask. I thank you so very much for listening. I cannot wait to see you again in the next one. And until the next time, stay connected, Internet people. See you on SEO. Bye.
You've been listening to the Audacious Ecosystem, the show where we learn together what it takes to make an ecosystem great from the leaders in the organizations around us.